Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, June 14th, 2011. I'm Barbara Tinnerman Cecil, and on behalf of Susie Spittler, I would like to welcome you to the 9th oral history taping. This time we're going to talk about Milton Union Schools again, and we have another distinguished panel of teachers and administrators. So without further ado, I will introduce the first one, Nancy Farrar Allen, who will talk to us now. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to talk about how things were. I understand we were able to compare how things were and how things are, and if you think about a classroom now, you'll know that when I started to teach 57 years ago, which kind of upset me when I figured that out, it was not a lot different, but it was different. My classroom was in Southern Ohio, and I had a big room with 42 desks nailed to the floor. I could not move any of the furniture, including the teacher's desk. Nothing was movable. My entire class had one kind of art supplies provided by the school. The rest of them came from me when I went to the dime store. And those art supplies were a big pile of pottery clay and a small kiln. That was it. I had no idea how to use it, but I learned, and the kids did too. In my classroom, the desk was a big, beautiful oak desk. I would love to have it now. You'd probably have to pay $1,000 for it. It had 4 drawers on one side and 8 drawers on the other. A great desk. But if I could have moved it, I would have moved it. I could probably have to live in it. It was huge. The blackboards were slate. All of them had cracks in them, but I didn't worry about that because that's what we had to use. As a teacher, I was expected to wear a dress or a skirt, and I was actually called on the carpet one morning when I went into school. My principal said, "I must see you." And I thought I was going to be in big trouble, and it turned out that yes, I was, because I had worn seamless hose to school, and he thought that was totally inappropriate. I wonder what he would think now. He was a great principal, but he had higher standards than I did, apparently. My first salary was, for the year, $3,365. And with that salary, it was my job to do everything with my class and take them out at recess, take them to the cafeteria, make sure they got on the right 5 buses at the end of the day, and anything else that came up. Any tutoring they needed was also on me, which was needed. I loved my job. The funniest thing about it is that I loved the kids. And I never got over that. There's no such thing then, of course, as a computer, but I remember taking in my portable typewriter that I had had in college and gave each one of the kids a turn on a typewriter, and only 2 of them had ever used a typewriter. Now that doesn't seem like long ago to me, but when I mention 57 years to my children, they fall over in a heap. All of our work pages, all of the things that the kids did were either torn out of workbooks or they were copied by me on a miserable crank copier, or I just drew them myself. The other things I did were copy things from the blackboard, and they needed to copy them 2 ways. They either hand printed them or they wrote them in what we call cursive now, and the penmanship had to be good. I don't think they even teach that now. There isn't time in the schedule. It was work. It really was work. I'd go home at the end of the day exhausted, but I felt so good. The only times I didn't feel good is if I felt I didn't get around to somebody who needed me to help them add or subtract or learn something that was obviously a need. So the next day, I'd go in and do that. It was fun. It was work, but it was fun. I always wanted to be the kindergarten teacher that I got to be the last 23 years that I taught. That's the best job in the world. I know I hear groaning going on, but that's true. I felt lucky, I felt blessed, I felt fortunate to have that job. In fact, my whole life was just one of those lucky people stories. I had the childhood I wanted and the growing up years I wanted and the silly times in high school that I wouldn't give up for $1 million and the good times in college and the marriage I wanted and the kids I want. How lucky can anybody be? And then to have the only job you ever wanted and keep it for 23 years, that's not too bad. There are no two children alike. We all know that. And maybe that's the reason I like kindergarten. If you had identical twins, they're not alike. One's older, one's different, one's shy, one isn't. Even twins are not alike. So I guess I would get bored if I had to do the same thing over and over, but with kindergarten, you can't do that. Maybe that's why I liked it so well. I don't know any other way to express it except that if I had another 57 years to teach and the health to do it, I'd probably have my hand up as a volunteer. I worked with good people. At Milton, I was overblessed, if there's such a thing. I had good people to work with. I had a good principal. I had the opportunity to grouch and gripe if that's what I wanted to do, and nobody threw me out of the building. And we worked together. If there was a need, had other teachers to call on. And one day, Mr. Donaldson, my principal, came in and he said, "Do you care if I observe?" And I thought, I don't care, stick around, whatever you want to do. And he said exactly what I expected him to say at the end of the time. He said, "Everything was pretty good, but your desk." Well, I knew where things were on that desk, and my desk at home to this day is like that. I know that about an inch down is whatever that is, and about a foot down is something else that I need. And my classroom desk was the same way. About the time he wrote that down and then explained to me by pointing at the paper, pay attention to that awful detail, little boy came over and said to me, "Where are my blocks that you took yesterday?" And I reached under the stack, pulled out his 3 wooden blocks, and handed them to him, and Nick said, "Touché." So that was just one of the many stories I could tell. The children in West Milton couldn't be improved on, and there were days that I wanted to do exactly that. And there were other days I wouldn't give up, and memories I wouldn't ever care to part with. Now, Alan Smith is next, and he's going to tell you about his side of the story.
Thank you, Nancy. First thing I think about with respect to Nancy is that our 2 boys had her as a kindergarten teacher and really profited from her teaching, and I think it was very instrumental in getting them off to a very good start in their educational careers. So we appreciated Nancy's work with them. Also, I think of Nancy in terms of coming to town with her husband, Coach Watt Farrar, when I was going to be a sophomore. And so I can date that back to about 1964 or so, and remember the impact that Coach Farrar as well as Nancy had on my life. So I appreciate them for that fact as well. I do appreciate the opportunity to share today. I labored over how to share some initial experiences, but I guess the first thing that came to my mind was I probably have a very unique experience, the fact that I was a student at Milton Union, and after 4 years at Wright State, came back to be a teacher, and then and I was a teacher and basketball coach and honor society advisor and so forth. And then after 15 years, I left Milton, went to Covington to start my administrative career for 3 years, but then came back as an assistant principal and a high school principal. So from about 1954-55, when I was a first grader, through 2001, when I retired from Milton Union, all but 7 of those years were spent at the Milton Union schools. And think of many, many positive memories over the years, working with these outstanding people to my right, as well as many, many other teachers and students that have been in our classes and so forth there. I can reflect back to the very first day of being in McKinley Building and being in Miss North's first grade class. And I was telling my wife the other day that I can still remember sitting in that class the first day worrying about the fact that I didn't have my crayons and my paste because my parents hadn't purchased those yet, so I was waiting anxiously so that I wouldn't be out of place if we had to do something creative that morning. So, the great experiences in McKinley Building. Our particular class was one that I think when we were in 4th and 5th grade, we had a couple sections were in the high school, in the 51 wing. So I spent 2 of my elementary years in the high school. And then as 6th graders, we went back to the McKinley Building because that was when they had built the elementary building. So we spent 6th grade at McKinley, but then in 7th grade, we went back to the high school. In those years at McKinley Building, we, of course, no cafeteria, so we had to walk from McKinley over to the high school for lunch, and we had to also go over there for gym. And it was really exciting on those rainy days when they either had to get buses to take us over or we made the mad dash. And I can still remember some kids coming back from lunch getting lost, so to speak, and not making it back in time. I can remember that experience as a teacher as well. When I first taught, I was in the morning I taught in the McKinley Building, taught mathematics, and then went to the high school in the afternoon. But I can remember teaching some classes after lunchtime, and the kids, some of the kids would be sitting there drenched because they had to come back through the rain there. But there are a lot of positive experiences, both as a student, or all as a student and as a teacher and as an administrator. So I can reflect back on all those different situations there. When I look at the experiences of a student, besides the times in the elementary building and, of course, in the experiences at the high school, one of the things I can remember as a 7th grader, our lockers were on the 3rd floor, and we were allowed, before the tardy bell rang, we were allowed to sit on the steps before the bell, but we couldn't go to our lockers until the bell rang. And let me back up. My lockers weren't there. My first period class was there. But the lockers on the 3rd floor happened to be the seniors. And that was the year when the football team, like Sam Knife and Cook and Berner and all those guys had lockers there. And that one year they all were going to not shave until they lost. Well, they went undefeated that year, so they had big beards. But I can just remember sitting on those steps, just idolizing those big guys as a 7th grader. The opportunity to be able to come back to be a teacher was very rewarding. I can recall that I had some contemplation as to what were the positives and negatives of coming back to teach at the school you were in. But it was a very positive experience. Looking at Mr. Widener, I can remember not only being in his class, but then also teaching with him. And then I had the unique experience when I came back as an assistant principal back in 88, 89. He was still teaching, and I was the assistant principal. And I'm not sure when you retired, but you might have still been there when I was principal as well. I can't remember. But being able to remember the times when I had to do those extemporaneous speeches in his class, to the time when I was sitting in his class observing him and evaluating him. So that was quite of a change there. Ed Lundensky was my principal as a teacher. Jack Williams was my principal as a student. Jack, I think, was principal for 17 years, and Ed was principal for 23 years. And I followed Ed, and I was principal for 10 years. So between the three of us, that covered 50 years. And I know there's a lot of high schools that have 3 or 4 principals in 10 years, let alone 50 years. So I was in good hands. I learned from excellent people, saw some great examples of leadership, and I appreciated the lessons I've learned there. Mr. Lindensky was also my basketball coach during my high school days. So it just seemed like I followed him in several aspects. He was a basketball coach, and I became a basketball coach after him, and then followed him as assistant principal and principal. Had the opportunity to be National Honor Society advisor several years, and I can recall having excellent relationships with the students there. And in particular, I remember Dr. Ginn being one of the students when I first started becoming an Honor Society advisor. And poor Doc had to put up with me for 3 years because I had him as a math teacher sophomore year, and then they moved me up to teach the juniors, and then when he was a senior, I had him there too. So, but I think he did pretty good. He came out pretty well. In talking with Mr. Lindensky a little bit prior to this, he mentioned that one thing that he had forgot to mention in his session was the importance of the relationship of the school and the American Legion. And we know the American Legion is sort of going by the wayside at the moment, but the support that the American Legion gave the schools was outstanding by sponsoring the Boys State and Girls State programs, Americanism tests, and they also helped quite often with the Veterans Day programs on November 11th. Clyde Smith in particular was one that I worked with, and he was always very supportive and helpful for the schools as we went through the opportunities to give the students to be in Boys State and Girls State. A couple other things, real quickly. The years that I coached basketball, I had 2 pretty good seasons, and they both stood out for separate reasons. One, in 1979, we had a losing season during the regular season, but we got tournament hot and won like 5 games and went to the regional. So the 79 team stands out for me by being outstanding at the right time of the year, and we had a lot of tournament success, and everybody was excited when we played at UD Arena for the last couple games. Then in 1982-83, I had another group of players who were outstanding as a team, and we finished 19-1 that year, won the league championship, and to my recollection, that's the only basketball championship we've had since 1954-55, I believe it is. So they need to be proud of their accomplishments. But while we had a great regular season, we didn't do well in the tournament. We lost our first game. So they stand out for 2 particular reasons. Then I also want to compliment the great teachers that taught under me as I was a principal. We had a lot of outstanding people that were willing to risk. They were willing to do things differently and out of the norm, and they were willing to put the students first, to do whatever we could to improve education. And in the 90s was a time of restructuring, and people were always looking at how can we do things better. And we had a group of teachers who were willing to try different things. And during that period of time, we tried different ways of grouping our students. For about 5 or 6 years, we used a block schedule, which was, instead of an 8-period day, we had a 4-period day with 90 minutes in each. And there were challenges for the teachers to be able to use that time effectively, but they did an outstanding job. During that time, we were able to apply for and obtain what they called a venture capital grant at that time, and that was where we got $25,000 a year for 5 years to use for staff development. And we were able to do a lot of things that proved beneficial to the students by having professional development time. And we were also able to treat our teachers professionally by having some excellent summer retreats and workshops, and we also had had the opportunity to travel and see outstanding conferences throughout the United States. I think it was in 1998 we were selected to be to get what they call a Best Practice Award by the state of Ohio. And I remember Sarah going over to the ceremonies with us to receive that award, and it was an outstanding evening, wasn't it? Probably the highlight of my professional career, where it was just sort of like the Academy Awards when they called groups up to give them their recognition. And that was good enough just to get the Best Practice Award, but when we were selected to get one of the best awards, we were really astounded as to that accomplishment. So I wanted to make sure I complimented my teachers for all the work that they did. And with that, I'll introduce Sarah Hayden. She was a Spanish teacher and an advisor extraordinaire. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
I guess I should say hola. Maybe some of the students that are watching that had me will remember that much of Spanish. I'm not sure that they'll remember a lot more. It's teaching a foreign language in a small school is kind of hard because at that time, at least, there wasn't any chance to practice it outside of school. So they became familiar with it. I had some very, very good students and some that continued on with it, which was good. But I always felt like that one of the main things I accomplished was maybe opening up their world to other cultures, to ideas of other places and other ways of doing things. And that was I think, a good thing. Alan said advisor extraordinaire, and I sometimes think that's true. I came here in 84, and in 85 immediately had the hat of class advisor put on my head. And here at Milton, we stayed class advisor all the way through with the students. So I'll have to admit that most of the students that I had as their class advisor, parents, I'm sorry to tell you, but I think they were part mine. I'm pretty sure I spent more time with them than most of you did during their high school years anyway, because it was extraordinarily expensive to get a group of students from freshman through their senior year. We were constantly trying to earn money. Paying for proms was expensive. Paying for floats every year and building floats every year was expensive. Providing a gift for the school in memory of the class was expensive. And so we did more than our share of paper drives and candy sales and anything and everything else that we could come up with, car washes, you name it, we did it. I was really proud of my classes. I had 3 classes that I shepherded through: the class of 89, the class of 93, and the class of 98. And with those 3 classes, the class of 89 contributed the senior benches that I hope will be moved to the new high school. We had them built specifically to fit in the high school and carved with the MU on it, and the seniors enjoyed the privilege of sitting on those benches in the morning before the bell rang and anybody else could get into the school. My class of 93 provided mine's going blank here, the signboard out front, the bulletin board, that announced everything that was going on in the high school, and I felt like that was something that was really nice for the whole community, because you could drive by at a glance and see what was happening. And then my last class provided the new bulldog. As many of you remember, the old bulldog was mistreated somewhat, and so we decided that we needed a new bulldog, and we're lucky enough to have a student whose father worked with a monument company over in Indiana. So we were able to get a little bit of a break on the price. Still didn't come cheap. And they came in and said, well, what do you want the bulldog to look like? Well, this is what the bulldog looked like. I happened to have him sitting on my desk because my daughter had given him to me as a Christmas present, since I taught for the Bulldogs. And so that's the image of the bulldog that is now standing out in front of the high school. And again, I'm hoping somebody will get busy and get that bulldog moved to the new high school, along with the bench that we put out there as well. The next hat, about 3 years later, Ed came to me, and as he so gently put it, I had 2 choices. I could either be lunchroom monitor, which didn't sound like a whole lot of fun, or I could be yearbook advisor. I thought at the time that yearbook advisor sounded like it was more interesting. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I will tell you that. And once again, hats off to the poor yearbook advisor that has taken my place, Linda Netzley, bless her heart, because putting out a yearbook is extraordinarily expensive. You have to come up with around $30,000, $35,000 a year to put that yearbook out. And very little of that comes from the sale of the yearbooks itself. And so there's a lot of activities, selling ads and other ways of making money. But the very first yearbook we put out, I happened to bring this one with me, was the Echo. My first one was 1991 Echo. And we won a national award for this one, which I thought for a little school like Milton to place in the top 5% of the nation of the yearbooks that were published, that we had done a very good job. And we tried really hard to make sure that all of the students were included. That was always my goal, was to get a picture of every single student in the school in the yearbook, whether they wanted to be there or not. And there were some of them that I really had to work at getting in there, I'll have to say. But it was, again, this was a way of working with students. Of course, the yearbook didn't end at the end of the year, so my editors and assistant editors wound up spending a good part of their summer in my basement finishing up the yearbook, because you had to finish it in the summer in order to get the whole year shown. The prom and all of the end of the year activities had to be finished up after school was out. So you had to have a dedicated group of students that were willing to do that. You also had to have an advisor whose husband and children were willing to let her spend that time, for which I'm eternally grateful. Alan mentioned the faculty at Milton, and that's the last thing that I want to talk about, because I do think that, at least while I was there from 84 till I retired in 1999, we had an extraordinarily close faculty at the high school. It was the activities, because of the grant, made a lot of that possible, because we got to know each other outside of the classroom, and that's hard to do in the high school, because normally you have to be right there at the classroom. You've got one group of kids leaving and the next group coming, and you don't really have time to socialize. We had meetings every morning, and then it went to weekly meetings, which was a pain when I was teaching, but in looking back on it, it was a way that we got together and could kind of touch base with what everybody was doing. And I worked in other buildings and in other schools, and I can tell you that that is not always the case. The high school was an extraordinarily close group of people, which made all the things you had to do a little bit easier, because most people were willing to jump in and help you out when you were really in a jam. We covered for one another. We helped out when I had prom to decorate the gym. Other teachers were willing to cover for me while I was in there with my students, or they were willing to let students out for a period if we really needed them, and things like that. So it was very helpful. I also have to say that as a high school teacher, without a group of parents that were willing to work with me, I could never have done it. There was always a core group of parents in the community that would step forward and offer their barn for us to build the float. They would offer to come in and help with whatever the fundraiser was. They were there helping to supervise the kids while we were decorating for prom. They were there serving the food for the kids and helping us chaperone for prom and clean up afterwards, and pouring bases for the bulletin board at the high school. I simply could not have done it without the parents. And while not every parent was able to or wanted to, there always seemed to be somebody in the community willing to step forward and help. And that as a teacher is an enormous thing, enormous benefit that I don't think you always find. The students were wonderful. As I said, I truly did think some of them were my own students, and I keep in touch with them, and I wish I could keep in touch with more of them, because they felt like mine. I spent so much time with them that they really and truly felt like part of my family. So it's a neat community, some neat kids, good administrators, good fellow teachers while I was working, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lorraine Kaufman.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, when I was thinking after Barbara called me, I thought, oh, all the memories that we have, and how do we, pin down the ones that we want to mention. But Nancy, I got it on you. I started 63 years ago.
You win. You win.
And I started at $2,000 a year. And that year I was hired at Gettysburg over on 36 as the second English teacher because the English teacher was being overloaded with her 5 English classes. Plus, I think she taught history, I'm not sure. That was my first year there. I taught 3 English classes, a Latin class, and had a couple study halls. And as I remember, I think I started sponsoring Y-Teens at that particular time. I left Gettysburg 7 years later. At that time, I taught all 4 high school English classes. I taught world history. I taught Latin 2. I sponsored Y-Teens and the junior class. I coached, oh, by the way, I coached 1 play my first year. I coached 2 plays, and anything anybody was doing in high school, we all worked with. In fact, I think the closest friends I've ever had in my life, in fact, at the time I said they were closer than my own brothers, were those teachers that I taught with at Gettysburg, because we were a really small school, Sarah. And, but when I stopped to think about it, of those English classes, there was no one that was less than 25. And I was one of those people that felt if you were teaching, supposed to be a teacher, you were a teacher and not an entertainer, which some kids complained about. But one of my goals, and I think I stuck to it all the way through, was I had each of my students write something almost every week to turn in. I never asked a student to do any paperwork that I did not read. And when I look back and think of, that was a lot of reading. But when I was thinking of all those things that I did, oh, by the way, you spoke of American Legion. When I was at Gettysburg, the American Legion sponsored the Prince of Peace contest. My last year there, I coached better than 20 kids, getting them ready for those speeches, which was an excellent speaking opportunity. They did not learn to write it, but they certainly learned to express themselves. So it was a good 7 years I spent at Gettysburg, and that's really home as far as, because I learned so much there. In fact, I've gone to several of their class reunions for their 50th and their 60th. And I told them, I feel as though I should apologize because I was so stupid when I was teaching you. I have learned so much, not only from my students, but just from, you know, natural experience. So it got more and more. My first year here at Milton was 57, 58. That year I taught all the juniors in the choir room, which was built, I suppose they call it stadium seating now. Did you have the same experience when you came in? And here you were kids tiered, and of course if anybody wanted to copy, there was no problem. But I always felt if kids copied, that was their problem, not mine too much. But when I stopped to think, I had 5 sections of junior English, again 25 or more in every class. And then I started thinking of those particular kids, and I don't know how many kids, who became teachers here at Milton afterwards. And it made me also think about all the professionals that have gone out of Milton. Have you ever stopped to think about all the doctors, the lawyers, the nurses, pastors, other teachers that have come out of our little school? Percentage-wise, it has to be a great percentage. So we as teachers must have done something to inspire those kids to go on. But then I don't want to forget about the farmers and the 9 to 5ers and that sort of thing, because they're the backbone of our whole country. So I enjoy looking back and thinking of all those kids, and they're always going to be kids as far as I'm concerned, and what they have done. After teaching here the 1 year with all the juniors, then we decided that we would have a family, and I stayed home, a stay-at-home mom, for 8 years, something like that. When Diane entered kindergarten, well, in fact, the year before Diane entered kindergarten, Mr. Osborne called me and said, I need a Latin teacher. I said, sorry, I have kids that are home. I won't do it. The next year, Jack Williams called, and he said, we need a Latin teacher. And I said, Diane's just going to be in kindergarten. He said, well, we'll put her in full-time kindergarten and you can teach all day. I said, oh, no. I said, I'm staying home when my kids are at home. Okay, then you come in and teach Latin in the morning and you can go home in the afternoon. So we did that. And at that time, the Catholic Church was still doing much of their service in Latin, so Latin classes were big. And then the next year, of course, Diane was in first grade, so I came in full-time. I still had 4 Latin classes and a couple English classes. Kept rather busy, and I spent totally then 21 years here at Milton Union. 31 years total teaching. The times here, some of the things I wrote down as you were talking. One of the projects that I sponsored was the FTA, which was originally Future Teachers of America. And I found kids in high school who wanted to help you elementary teachers, but they didn't want to become teachers. And I thought, well, why can't they help anyway? So actually it expanded, and I think I probably had 75 or 100 kids who would be walking back and forth in the rain maybe. But I know some of those boys particularly that I got started going over there really enjoyed working with those little kids. I remember one boy particularly was sitting there in the study hall, and you know how they'd sit. And I went to him one day and I said, wouldn't you like to be doing something more than sitting in this study hall? Yeah. I said, well, how about going over and helping Mr. So-and-so? I don't remember who it was. And would he want me? I said, he has it here on a paper that he could use a kid at such and such a time. And the kid just absolutely loved it. So I thought that was one of the best things that we offered our students. Nancy is say, yeah, because I know she had a lot of them. Let's see. And then talking of Ed, one of Ed's innovations was we should exercise more. Remember? And it happened that Chris, the art teacher, and I had a free period together. And I enjoyed those walks with Chris so much because otherwise I would never have gotten to know her. She was down there in the basement and I was up there on 3rd floor. And we would walk and discuss school problems, and probably sometimes not very appreciative, but at least it aired things. So that was one of the enjoyable things. Some of the innovations I think we as language arts teachers, Keith might hit this a little harder, we decided that we would give kids a little more variety, and we had 9 weeks classes, good and bad. One bad thing I felt from it, I didn't really get to know my students. Within 9 weeks, you don't really get to know them. Of course, some of them were repeat students. Going back to Gettysburg, I had, the first year I was there, I taught 8th grade. And then, as I said, I gradually had all the high school and no longer 8th grade. But there was one class at 8th grade of Gettysburg. If they didn't know English, it was my fault because I had them for 5 years. But there was an advantage too, because they couldn't come into class and say, we didn't have that. I said, oh, yes, you did. So there are advantages and disadvantages as you go along. We had the 9-week classes, as I said, which some were good, some were bad. Another thing that was started, we decided that we should introduce foreign languages to the 8th graders. So it was the top reading group that we introduced, gave each one of them 12 weeks of Latin, French, and Spanish. And of course, when I retired, that was the end of Latin. Of course, they were trying to get rid of it before that, but that was the end of it. But I still had some of those students that I started in 8th grade who would come out to the home in the summer, and we had our own individual little Latin classes, just picking up some of the things that I thought they could use. And I do want to give a pitch again for Latin. I still say Latin is the basic language, and I would like to see everybody, every student exposed to some of it, because our vocabulary is so rich with Latin words. And I think a greater appreciation could be made for literature from that. Changes in teaching atmosphere. I was trying to think back to discipline type things. And at Gettysburg, I think our big problem was the powers that be didn't want kids to chew gum.
Big problem.
Yeah, big problem, Keith says. And my theory on chewing gum was, and I told the kids, and I probably told them even over here at Milton, if I don't see it and I don't hear it, I have no complaint. But I don't want to see it nor hear it. And I don't think I ever got in trouble with the administrators for it, but I never told a kid to spit out his gum unless he had broken one of my rules, which was I don't see and I don't want to hear it. I don't know why I wrote that in there. Oh, yes, I do too. At Gettysburg, I taught world history, as I said. You know when I found out I was going to teach world history? On Labor Day, when we had our teachers' meeting. I did have, well, I actually could have a major in history, but I hadn't taught it for 6 years. I hadn't even thought about history for 6 years. So it was quite a shock to me. My theory as far as teaching was concerned, I'm teaching students. I'm not teaching textbooks, nor for a test. And that's what bothers me so much with the testing program, because I felt as though I needed that latitude in class. Even written lesson plans I objected to, Alan.
Sorry.
And didn't do a very good job of it, because I knew as soon as the students came into that classroom, my lesson plan would go out there. I had a basic, I knew what I wanted to cover for that day. And when I was teaching 3 sections of English Lit, I had my little card to make sure that I had hit every point, so that when test time came, they couldn't say that I had not covered it. But every class was different. And that's what made teaching exciting, because you didn't quite know what that child was going to be bringing into the classroom and what he was going to bring up. So I think the last thing I have down here is teaching is so humbling, but yet I feel proud of the students that I have had. And I was thinking, and I've often written this down, Tennyson said, I am a part of all I have met. And I think of that so much with particularly my students. I am a part of them, they are a part of me. John Donne also said, no man is an island, we are one. And I really have enjoyed teaching, and the camaraderie of the teachers. As Sarah mentioned, we were a bunch of people who liked one another. I can't say there was anybody in there, the staff, that I didn't like. You know, there's some that I felt closer to. But we have a lot to be proud of as teachers at Milton Union. And now Keith gets to have the pleasure of winding this all up.
Thank you. I think it's very appropriate that she should turn this over to me because I'm the one that she turned her classes over to when I started.
Yep.
I'm glad she decided to rear a family about that time. I might never have found a job. It was my pleasure to be her next door neighbor for a few years in the high school as well. Before I forget this one, I've got to tell you this one. One of the classes that I taught during the mini course phase included a story about a retired school teacher, and she was strictly a no-nonsense, effective academician. I mean, she was the 100% teacher, and we were reading this story, and this teacher approached things in a very practical way, a very problem-solving, pragmatic, by-the-book kind of a way. And we were reading that story, and I said, "We all know this teacher, don't we? Who do you think it is?" And at least 3 people said, "Mrs. Kaufman."
I had a reputation.
Well, I don't know. I think maybe they decided that I should be the cleanup hitter. Maybe it's because I'm the oldest one here.
No, you're not.
Well, I'm not going to ask you how old you are.
I started teaching in 48.
I graduated from high school in 47. So I stand corrected. But my teaching, in fact, my affiliation in a very personal, physical way with the Milton Union School District goes back 57 years. From the time that I was in elementary school in the 30s in Ludlow Falls, a 3-room school. I could talk for a couple of years about my experiences there, but I don't think that's why you're here. And from there, it has gone on. And in fact, my affiliation with Milton Union has spanned 8 decades. It makes me feel very, very old. Not all as a teacher, but I was present during the 30s in elementary school in Ludlow, and then in the McKinley building here, then over to what we called New Building in 1939. I graduated there in 47, so I'm covered for the 30s and the 40s. I took a couple of years off, went to the Air Force, came back then in the end of 52, and by the end of the 50s, I began teaching in 1958, so I covered the 50s there as well, and I was there until 1991, and I did some subbing, I think maybe even into the new millennium, but 8 decades, it makes me tired just to think about it. But at the same time, I'm pleased. It's not very many people who can spend their whole lifetime in the same school. I worked in many capacities for this school system. While I was still teaching, Mr. Smith can also verify this, we worked together a couple of summers on the maintenance gang, doing all manner of terrible things, including sealing the blacktop on the parking lots and the playgrounds, which was a very messy job. Spent a little time on the roof of every school building in the system, except the McKinley. Maybe they gave up on that one. But I spent a lot of warm, sloppy hours, but enjoyable hours in that profession as well. And then after I retired, along about 95 or 96, I guess, I began working in the maintenance department. I was a groundskeeper for 10 years. So when Steve Magato, who was a fellow worker during a couple of those years, said, "You back again? Are you a lifer?" And I guess maybe I am. Let me get right down to it. But my ties to the school, to the system, to the community go back a long, long way. And my life to this point has been very happy, and I'm pleased with the way things have turned out. I've met some wonderful people. I've had some unforgettable experiences. If I had a couple hours, I could share a few of those with you here. But I will try my best to cover some of the things. As I listen to these other people, I said, well, yeah, that's something I could talk about. But if I talked about all these things, we would be here for a much longer time, and I'm afraid is allotted to us. But one of the things I can think about, when I came in here seeking a job, they gave me the assignment to teach English 3 and a course that they called Senior Survey. And I had never heard of this one, but Jack Williams, who was then principal, said, well, you can get some information about this from Mrs. Kaufman. She had this last year. I said, okay, what? He said, well, it's sort of a remedial thing. The kids who are deficient in English take English, and then some for math. I probably froze at that moment because math and I are total strangers. But I went to talk to Mrs. Kaufman. I said, what do I do? She says, well, I guess I dropped the math part. I don't know whether Mr. Williams knew this or not, but that was good news to me. So I spent a lot of years teaching junior English. And one of the things that made me feel right at home, the textbook that we were using was a green-covered hardback called American Writers. And I recognized it at once. It was the very same book, the same edition even, that I used as a junior in high school. I knew the stories. I got a head start. But I felt like I was greeting an old friend, and I enjoyed the American literature part of that. But I did discover that, much to my chagrin, but not surprise, that there are a great many students in high school who don't particularly care about English. This was a shattering bit of news to me. But I did my best. In fact, somebody said, I guess Mrs. Kaufman said, or maybe it was Sarah, don't want to be an entertainer, I want to be a teacher. But I decided I better be at least part entertainer. So I tried my best. And we all survived, and I like to believe that in the process I might have improved somebody's usage a little bit along the line. Eventually, during the course of my career, I began teaching speech as well. And I was a little leery about this also because my background in speech was probably much narrower than any other teacher on the staff in any subject area. In Bowling Green, people in the College of Education were all required to take a 2-hour speech in course, basic fundamental speech. That was it. That was my sum total of training for teaching speech. But I wondered how I got this job, and I thought about it. And I remember once when I was sent as a delegate to the OEA convention, I had to come back and make a report. I laid it on. I went on and on. And evidently, I even got applause for that, and I was amazed. So I guess they decided when they needed a speech teacher, if the guy can deliver a speech, maybe he can teach others to do it too. But I taught speech for a few years, 7 or 8 years, I guess, without being certified or qualified really to do this. But I've often thought that teaching speech was probably the high point of my career. It was the most rewarding anyway, because this is one course where you could see the fruits of your labor. I would see kids come into that class with chattering teeth and knocking knees and perspiration on their brows at the thought of making a speech. And by the time they're out of there, they actually got very comfortable. In fact, some of them tried a few little risque notes and it was going. I remember they used to make reference to Lowry's Woods, which I had learned was a favorite trysting place for many of them. But this square teacher won't know that. And they got kind of risque. I remember another, well, I'm rambling here, I know, and I hope you don't mind. One experience that I had in a speech class, I did this quite often. I would make little slips of paper and write speech topics on for impromptu speeches. And we would draw, and they did draw a slip out of the hat, and one of them was my most embarrassing moment. And one of my students, whose name I shall refrain from mentioning, he said, my most embarrassing experience, and people were snickering and giggling, and he looked and he saw that his fly was open. He said, it was right about now. But it was great sport, and I think I enjoyed it as much as the students did. It was something that I didn't really have to prepare for. All I had to do is sit there in class and take notes and offer advice and give examples. In fact, one of the examples I gave, some of the undesirable postures to assume while giving a speech, one of them was called the fig leaf posture. You know anything about art and sculpture, you probably know the fig leaf posture, but we had one kid who to this day is called Fig, because that was his usual posture in speech class. One time I told the class, I need to have an outline for every speech that you deliver. I want it on paper. I don't care what kind of paper, your brown paper sack, but I want to know that you prepared this speech. I got one time from Brent Steiner, who turned it in on a brown paper sack. And at that point, I was glad that I hadn't mentioned toilet paper or something. But anyway, it was a great time. When I came back as a teacher, I felt like I was coming home. There had been a span of time between 47 and 58. That's a big chunk. But a lot of things hadn't changed. I walked down the halls that I used to walk through. The only big change was the construction of the 51 wing that was stuck on later, and the expansion of the gym and the home ec. But I walked down those halls. I even found the locker that I used to occupy. It used to be right across the hall from what was once the principal's office on the 3rd floor. And I recognized that locker because it had the marks of adhesive tape on the outside of the door. And I remembered that so vividly because when I was the editor of the Bulldog Bark, the newspaper, and I believe, I think I'm the guy who gave it that name, the Bulldog. Anyway, when I was the editor of this newspaper, I was deploring the fact that the boys' restrooms had no mirrors in our building. And it was a terrible thing. So I did a lot of research into mirrors. I talked about the cavemen and the puddles of mud and all this kind of thing. And I talked about our arch rivals at that time, Newton. Even Newton, I said, had mirrors in their restrooms. No wonder we can't get girls here, because we're not well groomed the way they are in these other places. We did have a little silver chrome-plated plate on the inside door to the restrooms that you could kneel down on and look into if you really were interested in combing your hair. But it was a terrible deprivation. But getting back to the locker, I was leading up to this. When I saw the adhesive strips on that locker, I remembered the editorial that I had written in the Bulldog Bark, appealing to the faculty and anybody in any position at all with the school to do something to avert a horrible catastrophe. So I got a reply, a gift-wrapped parcel one day, and it had a mirror in it. And one of my teachers said, "So that I can avert a horrible catastrophe." So the next edition said, "All students who are interested in grooming are welcome to use the mirror that I will tape on my locker." Well, it happened at that, well, I'm rambling again. It happened at that time that I was engaged in some kind of a drama production, and they were doing previews for a high school assembly. And I happened to be on stage behind the curtain at the very day that this issue of the Bulldog Bark came out about mirrors. And the superintendent, no, I guess he was principal then, R.W. Duncan, the guy with the scary eye. I can remember I was up on the stage and thanking God that there was a curtain in front of me between me and him, because our well-intentioned editor of the school paper was mistaken in the idea, and so forth and so forth. And so I'm just back there just kind of shrinking because I knew what he was talking about the mirrors. But anyway, getting back to my memories of being a student there, we had good times. I always told myself I was a good student. I was never valedictory material or anything, but I deluded myself into believing all these years that I was a really top-notch student. Until recently, I went browsing through some old things in the attic, and I found some grade cards in there. I had a lot of A's and B's, but on one of them, there's this flag of an F just jumped out at me, and I remembered that one. That was because I did not have a bug collection for my biology class. We went down to what is now the park, and we had a jar with a poison thing in it, and we collected bugs. I didn't have one, so I collected with several of us, put ours in a sort of a communal jar there. And I wound up divvying up, and I didn't get any. So there went my F for biology. So I felt that was a bum rap right there. I got one also, I think it was in civics. Lord, I hated civics. We had civics from Nellie Waymeyer in room 300, which ironically I came to occupy myself in the last 15 years or so of my career. but I like to believe that I didn't bore my students quite as badly as she bored me. And when I was doing my student teaching, I was assigned a class in civics. Would you believe this? I was doing my student teaching in civics in Bowling Green High School. I really had to wing it. I hated every minute of it. I was a social studies major in college, and the closest I came to teaching social studies was one year they had me teaching geography to 7th graders when they were all in the same building, and another time I taught Ohio history to 8th graders. But by that time, I was quite comfortable in English, and I didn't want to go back to history and all that sort of thing anyway. But those were some of the experiences that I remember. Some of the things were changed that maybe ought not to have been changed. One of the things, I don't know whether anybody has noticed this or not, but there used to be, on the exterior of the building, every place that there was a right angle corner up there on the facade, there was a large decorative urn, sort of like the kind Alibaba hid in the robber's cave. They are not there. And has anybody noticed their absence? There used to be one of those on every corner of the high school building, and they're not there anymore. And this bothers me. Somewhere, somebody's collecting these things. Well, let me see. When I went back there, the other things that were the same, Ray Diley was still there. He was there when I was in high school. And Edith Noble, about whom I cannot say enough. I think Edith Noble was the best teacher that ever trod the face of the earth. She was a role model for me. She was my inspiration. She's the one, I think, that gave me the idea that I would like to become a teacher. And it came to pass. Even though she was a very small person, she was quite small, she had shoes that were much too big for me to fill. When they asked me to teach speech, I thought, what? You're asking me to take Edith Noble's place? There is no way. I felt very incapable. But she was an inspiration. So she and Ray Diley were there, that still, and Theodora Stocksdale was still there. And she was the embodiment of all things that you must think about in being a home ec teacher, one of whom I married, incidentally. I had a lot of hats to wear, like Sarah did. I was also a class advisor. The first time it was to the class of 1964. I inherited them as 7th graders, and for 6 years they were my family. And when they graduated, I felt like I'd lost my family. We had, a couple of years left in school. I must have been a gloomy Gus at that time. I felt abandoned. I loved those kids. I still do. I still see some of them, and they're friends, and I'm glad of it. So I was a class advisor. I was also the newspaper advisor. I chaperoned countless dances. I helped direct some plays. I advised student council. I was kind of busy, but I liked to be involved because, another thing, if I can go off on another tangent, I think one of the things that sort of compensates a teacher for what is sometimes a insufficient salary. I made the munificent sum of $4,000 on my first contract. But I think that was made up for in the thing that we were surrounded with. You've got to care about kids if you want to be a teacher, and you've got to a degree to love them, and you expect maybe to be loved back. That should not be the primary concern, but it's a nice feeling when you get it. And I think that no matter what the salary is, that's part that you take as a bonus. But I once wrote an essay about this, and I talked about the fountain of youth. And I said that I have, unlike Ponce de Leon, who, as far as I know, never did find that place, I found it. I found it in teaching. And in that essay, I extolled all the merits of being a teacher. You're surrounded all the time by young ideas, young attitudes, young values, and youth itself sort of swallows you up. And I feel that as long as I'm there and they are there, I won't ever really get old. And now you see before you someone who is no longer teaching and who is suddenly old. When I retired in 1991, Alan Smith was principal because his predecessor, Ed Landensky, retired the same year that I did. You asked if you were ever principal when I was teaching, not as a regular, but as a sub. I had not been retired very long. I used to feel guilty when the first day of school came along. I felt that I was truant. They're having school without me. Somebody's going to be after me. But I hadn't been retired very long. I got a call from Alan Smith. He said their teacher of sophomore English suddenly took a job as a guidance counselor in another school system, and we wondered if you would fill in until he can be replaced. And I thought, that's what I had been teaching for the last 15 years or so. Unfortunately, I had destroyed all my resources. But he says it won't be long just till we get some. It must have lasted 6 weeks or so. But there I was, same room, same subject, but I was there, and had to sprain my brain to come up with new drill sheets to use in teaching grammar. If I can divert again one more time, one of the joys of teaching was making up sentences for them to parse and label and all this kind of, and it got so boring. I don't know how many times I underlined the subject once, the verb twice, identify all the complements and so forth and so forth. But I began using stories that we had in American Lit. I would make up sentences. The Outcasts of Poker Flat was one of my masterpieces. But I made up sentences using those sentences, and the kids seemed to appreciate this. Hey, okay. So anyway, that's where I was. After I had retired, I'm back doing the same old thing. After I had destroyed or given away or forgotten all the things that I had amassed over all those years, I was glad to finally get my pardon because being a sub is not the same thing. You know, every day when you go into a classroom as a sub, you've got to prove yourself. Kids used to know me. They know what I expect. I know what to expect from them, and they know what to expect from me. But not so with kids who don't know you. You got to be hard-nosed, and that was not something that came easily to me. Ever since my days in the Air Force, after I came back from overseas, they sent me to Keesler Air Force Base, where I had gone to tech school to be an instructor in control tower operator classes. And I kind of enjoyed it because I knew what I was doing. I'd been in the field for a couple of years. But one of the duties was study hall. And you know, I have never been a tyrant, and I couldn't be if I tried. I used to really work at it, but it never came across. One time, we had two sections to the class I taught, the ultimate, the 13th and 14th weeks of a 14-week course. The first week was in a classroom in a tin building, and the other one was in a tower right down along the fight line, a beautiful student tower, multi-million-dollar tower at the time I have never seen before. But when I was in that tower, I decided I'm going to be bad. So I talked to the guy who was teaching the 13th week. I said, tell them to expect the worst from me because I am bad. Make it up if you have to. So, as tradition called for, I went over there to the building when they finished their last session, and I marched them over to the flight line to the tower. We used to straggle over there, but I fell them in, had them doing close order drill all the way back to the tower, and I had them standing at attention while I gave them a lecture on maintaining silence while going through the classrooms downstairs. And boy, they were standing there at attention. I thought, okay, you're dismissed. Now quietly go up to the tower. So I came up last, and I got up there, and they're all standing at attention beside their chair in the tower. Whoa, how about this? And I tried for one whole day, and I began to weaken by the time it was over. And then I tried it again the next day, and it was even. By the time I were in there the third day, we were pitching pennies together against the console. I just couldn't bring it off. But I like to believe they were pretty well prepared to be tower operators when they got out of there. As far as I know, I was the first guy that was ever recalled from the field to teach it. And the rest of those teachers had never even seen a control tower. They said, "Did you ever have any emergency in the tower?" Oh, well, yeah, about one a day. They thought that was an extraordinary situation. So I said, "You got to do things by the book, but sometimes it doesn't work." Well, anyway, that's all part of teaching, but I enjoyed it. I retired with some reluctance, but I guess enough is enough. And some of the things that the people have told you, I have to say amen to. If I have any regrets, I think it's not, well, I don't know if I have any regrets now that I think about it. I'm glad I did it that way. And if I had it all to do over again, I would do it again. Maybe I would do it differently, but I thank the citizens of the community and the school board for giving me the opportunity, and I thank you people for bearing with my rambling dissertation. Thank you so much.
Anybody else? Anybody else have anything to add?
I just recall when Mrs. Kaufman said she was in the choir room, my first year of teaching started in the middle school or junior high. But then when I went to the high school to teach, I had 2 classes of all boys and 2 classes of all girls in math, and it was in the choir room.
Was it?
And it was like mission impossible to try to maintain control and make
And
make
besides,
sure there
there's
was
no blackboard.
yeah, right, exactly. You had a little scrawny little green thing there, and then you had to walk around the piano that was stuck in there. But anyway, it was quite an experience, and for a first-year teacher, it was a definite challenge every day. But that's one of the things that struck me.
That's teaching.
Exactly.
Well, you know, Alan,
Innovative constantly.
speaking of this, I had classes in that same room. In fact, my first year of teaching, I had no room of my own at all. I wandered around. I had classes in different room every time, and invariably I had left something behind that I needed on that occasion. But speaking of 209, the chorus room, that was the year that they were just putting the finishing touches on the gym auditorium addition, and they were unloading folding chairs out, and they carried them in through that courtyard and up the fire escape. I remember I had a class at that time, a homeroom in that room. And I'm looking down there watching them. I thought I ought to kind of keep an eye on them. So the kids were carrying chairs, and there's one girl. She was standing on the landing of the fire escape up there, and she said, "You boys, it's not nice to look up girls' dresses," because they're standing down there underneath the fire escape.
Mrs. Hayden, you had mentioned earlier about some of the things that motivate kids to improve their grades. Can you share anything about that?
We were talking earlier about the students. I said it was always amazing to me how the grades improved just about the time they were due to get their driver's licenses, particularly, excuse me, for the boys. They seemed more concerned, I think, because more of the boys were having to pay for their own insurance. And if they had good grades, the insurance rates were lower, and so the grades would come up. Most of the students, I'll have to say, I was fortunate, or had a different experience, I suppose, because of teaching Spanish. I had students that were choosing to be in that course. It was an elective. And so I tended to get the best students. I'll have to say I was a little bit spoiled. I did not have the very worst of the worst discipline problems, except as their class advisor. As Alan can attest, my last class, I nearly lost all of my hair. I came down with a case of shingles the last week of school, and I can guarantee you that that was the cause of it. But generally speaking, I had some really neat students in class, and not horrible problems with any of them. As I said, the parents were cooperative. I tended to have parents that were really interested, so it was fun. But yeah, grade time or else eligibility for sports. Those were the 2 things that would really nail them to the wall if their grades were dropping off. So you could use that leverage. above all things. Now, I had other little tricks. I took a couple of classes to Mexico, and they knew that if they didn't do well in class, they weren't going to get to go on the trip with me. That helped motivate that group, and so it was different things for different kids. But it was funny. Before those licenses, that just as they would get ready to turn 16, you'd see this uptick in the grades, and it was because they had to get their insurance rates down.
John?
I got a question. Nancy, what school did you start teaching in?
When I started to teach, I started in Bourneville, Ohio, which is down south, almost into Kentucky. It was a great little school. It really was. And then I went from there to Chillicothe, where I was a sub and did tutoring in my home. They would excuse the kids from school, and they would walk 2 blocks to my house so that I could give them their remedial reading, which I thought was great because my baby was in a playpen right beside me. And that was a wonderful thing. Parents had to pay for that. $2.65 every time the kids came to my class. I loved that.
How did you get to West Milton?
Well, I came with my husband. When Watt came to West Milton, I did too. And I was going to be a substitute teacher, and I was for a while. And then I signed a contract to come in and teach, and found out that Bill was on the way, so I canceled that out. And then when Bill was a year old, Jack Williams called me on the phone. He said, "We still have your contract on file. How about coming in next year?" So I did, and I loved it. But you mentioned your math skills. Nobody ever accused me of being a math star, and I know they never will. But I think it's kind of funny that my husband now, Don, says to me that he knows the reason I was in kindergarten for 23 years here is that I couldn't pass the math to go to first grade. And that's not quite true, but close, because my checkbook is his project. I can't handle it.
I do have one interesting thing about teaching, because I'm not quite, haven't been in the profession, was not in the profession quite as long as some of the others, but still, to show how things changed. I started out teaching in Troy my first 2 years, and in my contract there, I was the first teacher at Troy that was allowed to teach, finish out the year, even though I was noticeably pregnant, because I was teaching German and they couldn't find somebody to take my place. Other than that, you had to resign at the end of 4 months. And so,
I remember that.
you know, the difference between those days, which was in 69, 70 was the year that my daughter was born, and now, you know, it's a huge change that has taken place in the profession. But I'm like Lorraine, I taught for the 2 years, was the German teacher, stopped to stay at home with the girls and raise them, and then when I decided I'd get back into teaching, I finished out the teaching requirements and came to interview here just as an experience in interviewing. Had not planned to teach until my daughter was in first grade instead of kindergarten. And they called me the day before school started and said, now, what was your starting salary here again? And I said, I beg your pardon. The communications had gotten crossed, and I did not realize I had a job that first year until the day before school started. But anyway, all worked out.
I was just going to mention that you mentioned Ray Diley, but I also want to mention about Doc Staley and the adventures that he had in the shop, and making crazy owls and things of this nature, you know. But also I can remember he was famous for his officiating. He was a baseball umpire, and in many years our baseball game was one of the better ones at that time, and we used to host tournaments in spring, and they'd play those in the afternoon, so we'd get out of study hall or whatever to go out and watch a baseball game. But Doc would always be out there umpiring, and you could always tell his distinctive calls and so forth there. And before we started taping, you mentioned about the sower, and the sower was a statue that was on the front landing area of the steps, and somehow that just disappeared over the areas. But looking at memories, remember what happened to the front of the school during Halloween periods.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
That might have been mentioned before, I don't know, but finally that tradition got stopped after it got a little bit carried away at one point or another. But a lot of things we can look back and reflect upon. That was very enjoyable.
Yeah. Thank you all very, very much. It's been wonderful again to hear all about Milton Union Schools, and Of course, it has a special place in my heart because I worked there as well and was a student there as well. So thank you very, very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you.